talk more about the blood flow piece and the heart not being the primary mover of blood. Again, reading your book, this is one of the things that was new information to me. It's assumed in conventional medicine that the heart is contracting and pumping blood through the arterial system and the venous system. You've brought in this other piece, but you also did say that the heart does contribute. How much would you say the heart is contributing versus this easy water piece?
Well, I don't know about exact ratios, but it's a very little amount. So the heart does do some pumping, but it's really no more than enough to move the blood through the chambers of the heart itself. And the reason, so we'll talk about the reason the heart is there too. But the heart is not a pump in the sense that if people go back and listen to the first part of this whole thing, they'll probably realize that I never referred to the heart as a pump. I always said the heart's contracting, not pumping, because that's what I firmly believe. And there is a whole host of literature on this subject. There's a whole book called The Heart and Circulation, written by Dr. Branko first, that reads like a 200-page research paper with tons of citations about how we have so much evidence that the heart could not contract strong enough to pump the blood throughout the entire body. And in school, we learn things like, the one-way valves in the veins prevent it from coming back, and the movement of your muscles helps the blood move. But if you look at, there's studies that show, if we look at the heart as a pressure propulsion pump, a pump that sucks in fluid from somewhere and forcefully pumps it out somewhere else, the amount of energy that it uses based off how much fluid moves through it, or it moves, quote unquote, it's only about 15 to 30% efficient, which, whether you believe we evolved or we were created, that's not a very efficient way to create something whose job is to move fluid, right? And so it can't be the main mover of the blood. So, and also just logically, if I was going to pump blood from my toes to my head or to my chest, I wouldn't put the pump at the top of the hill. I'd put it at the bottom and pump it up, right? So it doesn't make sense logically, but also, like, we have to ask ourselves, how does water get from the roots of trees up to the leaves? There's no heart in a tree, so it has to move by different mechanisms. And in Dr. Pollack's lab, they've shown that in tree roots that this structured water formation happens, and it moves water through the tree roots and up against gravity, so to speak. So there's no way that the heart could be the main mover of the blood. And in fact, there's evidence that when the heart is being forced to be more of a mover of the blood, it's because these other mechanisms are broken down in the body, and that's when that's one thing, it's one small part of what can develop heart failure. The heart is being forced to be more of a pump than it's supposed to. So if the heart is not when we've shown and we've talked about the mechanism by which blood does move. And so the heart actually operates more like a hydraulic ram, which I didn't know what that was when I first read that. I was like, what's a hydraulic ram? So I had to go to YouTube and learn what a hydraulic ram was. And the heart's actually two hydraulic rams put together, the left side and the right side. And so a hydraulic ram is a mechanism that is flow activated. So it has to have something flowing into it to be activated and to function. And there's a few differences between the heart or one side of the heart and a hydraulic ram, but they're minor differences. So in a hydraulic ram, water is flowing down into something from gravity, and then it fills up one chamber. And then when it fills it up, it closes a valve, and that creates increased pressure. And then that pushes another valve open. And then when it pushes that open, the water flows into the next chamber. And then when it flows up into that chamber, it flows up so much that it fills up, and the pressure created by that filling up closes the valve again, that valve that opened to let it in. And when it creates that pressure, it flows out another valve. And that pressure that's created, it pumps it out, sort of. It's a hydraulic ram pump, but it's flow activated. There's no force, right? And engineers, can tell you how hydraulic rams work better than I can. But I compare the analogous structures of a heart, or one side of the heart, and the hydraulic ram in the book. And there are two differences. One is the heart doesn't have a spill valve in the first chamber. And instead of pressure building up and pushing back, there is a contraction of a ventricle that provides that little push. But again, it's just enough to push the fluid out of the ventricle itself. And then once it gets back out into the arteries, the structured water mechanisms pick it up and it moves it along. There's even actual evidence that the blood has some magnetic properties. And so when a valve opens, there's actually more of a suction happening out of the ventricles. It's not if it was a pumping thing, we would see the aorta, which is an arch. If it was a pump like that, we'd see the aorta arch expand. Just like if I had a hose that was coiled up on the ground and I forcefully turned on the hose would like unravel, right? We don't see that. When you look at angiograms and visualization of the aortic arch, when the heart is supposedly forcefully contracting, it actually curls up like this, like there's a suction happening. And that's what happens, is that because of that magnetic attraction, when the ventricle valve opens, it sucks the blood out of it, and you're creating this contraction effect of the aortic arch. And so that's how the heart works. It's this hydraulic ram pump, so to speak, but it has to be flow activated. So if the flow mechanisms are broken down, like if we're not getting enough structured water and we're not grounded and we're doing things that interfere with blood flow, we have a lot of bound up fascia in our body, those types of things, then the blood is moving more stagnantly through the heart, and the heart's being forced to be more of a pump than it's supposed to be. And that puts a lot of strain on the heart. And it's one thing that can contribute to the development of heart failure, where instead of the heart contracting in a spiral-like nature, it starts to balloon out and become this basketball-shaped thing, this cardiomyopic situation. So the heart is not a pump. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that. And so what is it then? What's its purpose? And in my opinion, there's 3 different roles of the heart in the body. None of them are to forcefully move blood. One is another way that we energize water is by vortexing it, which means swirling it around or swishing it around in some way. And this makes sense because in nature, water is always moving. It's always being swished around. It's crashing on the beach. It's being evaporated and precipitated. It's flowing in rivers. Nature is not keeping water stagnant, and if it does get stagnant, like in a pond or a puddle, it gets dirty. And it's not really, it's like builds bacteria. So water is always supposed to be moving. However, when you move it through pipes, like in our blood vessels, it doesn't get swished around very much. So you have to insert a mechanism into the middle of those pipes, which is a peculiar place for a pressure propulsion pump would be in the middle, because it's not a pressure propulsion pump. And it's there to mix up the blood pretty much. It's a vortexing hydraulic ram. And that's exactly what we see when the blood is flowing into the heart. It flows in like a vortex, kind of flows in like that. Kind of like when you drop one of those quarters in those things and it goes around like that. It flows in like that. The heart is actually one big band of muscle that's wrapped up on itself. So when you unfold it, it's this one big continuous band of muscle. You wrap it up on itself, and when it contracts, it spirals like this. And so it's vortexing the blood. Also, when the blood flows out of the valves, it's eddying on both sides. So it's just creating this disruption of flow to vortex the blood and energize it in the presence of oxygen. So there's no mistaking, or there's no coincidence that the blood comes into the heart, gets vortexed, goes to the lungs, comes back to the heart, gets vortexed again, to get more in the presence of oxygen. And then so that when it gets out to the bloodstream, it is more energized so that it can form the structured water and create blood flow. So in a way, indirectly, the heart is responsible somewhat for the flow of blood, but it can't do it itself. It needs the right environmental stimuli to do it as well. So we need infrared light and grounding and things. And so that's the first role of the heart. The second role of the heart is that in times when we exert ourselves, the tissue demand for oxygen and nutrients is so high that if the heart wasn't there to actually slow the flow of blood, all the blood would rush over to the arterial side, and the venous side wouldn't have enough pressure and it would collapse. And so the heart is actually slowing the flow of blood in exertion. And there's some very eloquently done studies showing this in endurance athletes, that indeed whenever they're exercising, the heart is kind of a damming up organ. It's stopping the flow of blood. So people think, like endurance athletes have this hypertrophic heart. The heart can get bigger in size and muscle. And it's actually because they've shown that it's better at stopping the flow of blood than forcefully pumping it. So it's kind of like a bigger catcher's mitt, to catch the flow of blood and then, vortex it. So it's there to stop the flow of blood during exertion. And then the third aspect of this, or the third role of the heart, is that it has the heart has the highest electromagnetic field of any organ in the body. It's letting off this electromagnetic field. And so all organs let off this field, and organs with the highest amount of mitochondria let off the biggest field. So the eyes, the brain, and the heart have similarly high amounts of mitochondria. So why is the heart giving off the biggest electromagnetic field? It's because there's evidence that when you vortex, when you spiral something in an electromagnetic field that's already exists, it amplifies the field exponentially. And so because the heart is the moving organ that's spiraling in our body like this over and over again, it's amplifying that field. So researchers have detected this electromagnetic field from, I think, up to 16 feet away. And so it's the organ that we reach out into our environment with, which is why we attribute all of our emotions and our feelings and everything with our heart. We feel things with our heart because it's what's allowing us to connect to other people's field and also connect with the environment around us. It's measuring coherence in the body. So it's measuring how synced up and communicating our body is, and all of our cells are signaling. And it's a sensory organ. It's sensing our emotional state and relaying that information to the brain, which is why we say I love you with all my heart and not I love you with all my brain. So it's an incredibly fascinating organ that I don't think we fully understand, and it's incredibly important to understand if we ever want to tackle heart disease.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch the full episode. I'll see you over there.
Life is just all about harvesting energy from the environment and using it to create order. And if you don't have enough energy in the system to maintain the order, you get disease. Things start to break down. And so the first place that the body seems to sacrifice